Welcome everyone again to the third and final session of Olam, Shanah, Nefesh, becoming attuned to revelation in text, self, and world. With that, I'll turn it to you, Rabbi Mace.
Wonderful to see you all. Thank you so much for making the time as we get close to Shavuot. The revelatory juices are really beginning to flow, and it's so nice to really be here together. So we've done some two-thirds of the work that I had hoped to do in this class. We've thought about Shanah, time, and how revelation happens on a yearly basis, not just on a one time in a historical basis, but as something that transpires across the years. We began with that Hasidic source that says that not only does it happen each and every year, there is Kabbalat Torah, our receiving of the Torah that goes along with Matan Torah. Not only does that happen on a yearly basis, it happens on a daily basis. And how do you know? Because the texts never look the same. The texts are always different because we ourselves are different. And so the armature, the framework of the sources may remain, although of course Torah is ever changing. So there are always new things that are added to the canon and new voices that allowed old texts to be read in new ways. The the texts themselves serve as a conduit or a portal or an entree into the divinity that lies beyond the realm of language. So we thought about Shana in that context. We thought about Nefesh, soul, in the sense of like what the Hebrew Bible says about Nefesh. There's a soul and there's a body, and they're not two distinct things, but they're intertwined with one another. And we thought about the ways in which our own embodiment and our own stories and our own understandings of a text are not just reflections of the wisdom in the text, but they themselves, what happens within us as human beings in this world, is another dimension of that revelatory story. In that unfolding process of revelation, we have revelation in texts over time, we have revelations in the soul and in the spirit, and now we're going to turn to the world around us as a site and as an agent of revelation. Just to wrap up one thing that I had left on the table last week, I have given you, you have in the source packet, the passage from Rabbi Kalonymus Kalman Shapira, the practice of quieting the mind. Did anyone take a look at it? Yeah, Tomer's nodding, Gurval. Yeah. Anyone else? We'll do it. It's great. It's a really, really interesting source because, well, two things. Oftentimes when I don't know if you have this experience, when I'm reading Hasidic sources, I often find the question arising within myself, so how do I make this happen? Like, how do I actually get there? I love the description, and it's almost like a normative description of what something could be or better ought to be. And I wonder, so what are the brass tacks? How do I actually get there? And those specifics are somewhat rare in Hasidic sources, and there are a couple reasons for that. One, it's a question of genre. We often read the Hasidic homilies rather than what are called the Hanhagot. Hanhagot are practices. You can translate them into non-English English as the regimen vitae, the kind of life path. In Buddhist terminology, this would be the Vinaya, the monastic rule or the rules of conduct that a particular, let's use the word Sangha, then the community of practice uses. We have those in Hasidic sources, but they don't generally make their way onto source sheets, in some cases because they're just so extreme, and in some cases because they're less theologically exciting and rich. They're the brass tacks. They're the how do you make this happen? A second reason that I think these are less common is that oftentimes those works, the written works, the homilies, were accompanied by a kind of oral instruction. And that was rarely written down. And it was immediate in the sense of being quite intimate, in the sense of being related from one person to another, a teacher to a student in that particular moment. And those practices were a kind of oral Torah that existed within the Hasidic community, which were lost both with the vicissitudes of time and just the 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 changes of history, especially in the second half of the 19th century. But they were also one of the many, many, many cultural reservoirs that were destroyed in the Holocaust. Because with the death of so many Hasidic leaders went the fountain of knowledge that came along with them that they had inherited from their teachers, from their parents often, and the many, many followers who rarely wrote these things down but carried them forward in their lives and in their bodies. The teaching that you have as the Inyana Hashkata, or the practice of quieting the mind, is one that was written down in Japan in the early 1940s by someone who was very close to Rabbi Kalonymus Kalman Shapira. His name was Eliezer Bein, who had made his way east and was actually saved from the Nazis because of that. And he was interested and committed to putting down into writing the things that he was afraid were going to be destroyed. And one of the really, I would say, heartbreaking elements of this text is that if you look at the original handwritten version of it, which was written in a small notebook, it said, "These are the teachings of my blessed master, Rabbi Kalonymus Kalman Shapira, Shlita. May he live long and prosper." And when he wrote it down, Rabbi Shapira was dead. He didn't know that. And in all of the printed editions, it has the formula for someone who has been martyred. So when he writes this down, he feels the world underneath him crumbling. And as such, I think he's committed to writing these things down because he wants them to endure. So this is one of those rare texts, and he describes being called into the Rebbe's office. He was a person of some significant spiritual stature, and the teacher, Rabbi Kalonymus Kalman Shapira, gave him a practice. And he said, "This will be very helpful for you in your spiritual development. You quiet your mind through a steady process of noticing your thoughts," right? In Buddhist terminology, this would be you see the thoughts that are T1, thought one level, and you try to allow your mind to come to quiet such that the second order thinking, what's called T2, is allowed to just go out and then to pass. And so you slowly come to a place where you notice the thoughts, you sit with the thoughts, you quiet the thoughts. But then with that negative space, it's not empty space, it's negative space, then you do something. That's the space in which you begin to pray. And what you do, says Rabbi Shapira, is that you choose a particular midah that you want to work on. If one has a tendency toward anger, one chooses that. If one has a tendency to struggle with matters of belief, one chooses that. If one has a tendency toward morosity, one chooses that. If one has a different kind of spiritual struggle, whatever it might be, that's what you do within that space. You pray, you think, you examine, you refine, you do that work of polishing that we talked about. Then you sing the nigun, you sing the song. And he says that if you do this for long enough, you will hear God's voice. And you will be able to say, Ze Eli ve'anvehu. This is my God, and I shall point to that divinity. And because this person survived, we actually also know that song. So we have these little pieces of what were originally a Torah Sheba'al Peh. And when I was in undergraduate, I took a class on the Dead Sea Scrolls. And the first day of class, my teacher walked up to the front of the room and said, "Before you make any assumptions about what anything means," she drew a piece of like a one little point on the very top left side of the whiteboard and said, "This little point represents what we have, and everything else is what we've lost. So make before you make any assumptions about ancient Judaism was like this or ancient Christianity was like that, just remember you're working with a sample size that is so incredibly diminished. We have very little idea of what's been lost." And I think there's something very true within the Hasidic canon, of how much was lost along that way. Beth, please.
I initially shook my head when you asked if we'd read this, and actually I did read it and I forgot that I read it. That happens a lot.
Yeah.
What I wanted to know is, how do we find out the tune? Where do we get his tune?
I think it's been uploaded onto YouTube. There are a number of different people who have set it to music or at least recorded it. It's not that hard. I can tell you, it's very simple. It goes like this. It's from the book of Psalms. Hareini Adonai darkecha, Hareini Hashem darkecha, alech ba'amitecha, yached levavi le'ava et shemecha. And it goes like this. Hareini Hashem darkecha, ahalech be'amitecha, yached levavi lira et shemecha. And that's it. It's that over and over and over again. And I think if you've ever heard a Hasidic tune from the community of Slonim, it's like, what's more? It's like Schoenberg and Philip Glass combined with one another. You mamish can't follow it. At least I can't. I never know where those things are going. I go low and they go up. They go up and I go low. Like I can't follow them because they're so atonal, and that's intentional. I think this one is intentionally simple because it's meant to be. It's meant to be like a kind of mantra that drives forward. Again, not an empty space, but a negative space, which is held intentionally. And so by doing this, you are summoning up divine presence. You're calling God into being through this presence, through this practice.
I have a follow-up question as well. So when does that happen in Jewish prayer? Because our prayers, our services are quite structured. They are full of words.
Yeah.
There is merit in the words, and you know, there is an ability, I think, sometimes for the words to be this this vessel or this ark or this gate. So it does happen, but this is obviously not possible to do in the context of this structured, full of words prayer. So I'm curious to know, is this something that the Hasidim were doing outside of or before? Because I understand that at least the Ari and his followers were coming to shul, hours before the service and getting ready for the service. Is this in preparation of? Is it after? Is it when is that happening?
Yes.
This practice.
Yeah, both. You find it before, as a way of what in Hasidic Hebrew would be called hachanos, preparation for prayer. It's often just the justification for the famous Hasidic delay in prayers is often given. While they might end up praying only at 10 or 11 or later, they start quite early with those preparatory acts. And if you see preparation not as getting ready for, but the beginning of, then It's all one expansive experience. And so oftentimes this is exactly that. It's the kind of, let's say, the fertile ground from which language-based prayer can grow. Sometimes it is described as not the silence at the beginning of the symphony, right before the orchestra strikes up the note, but the silence before the clapping at the very end as the music has receded or the music begins to echo and sort of saturates the concert hall. That's the moment in which this kind of silent contemplation can happen. And then there are other times where it's really seen as non-statutory, in the sense it's not one of the three that have been decreed or at least accepted, and it becomes something that is accessible at all times. You can go out and do it in the morning, you can go out and do it in the afternoon, you can go out and do it in the middle of the day, you can do it in all different times. And in fact, in Hasidic circles, the way that this is commonly described is the term that comes to us from Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav, hisbodedus, which happens oftentimes in the forest because there's something magical about being surrounded by trees. But this is something that happens in the Beit Midrash as well. I think this is something where Rabbi Shapiro's practice is something that could happen in those waning moments of the morning before the afternoon rush. It can be any different time. Yeah, Beth, please.
Speaking of preparation and or the beginning of, I'd like to share with this group something that I really like to do before davening. And it involves cross-body work. And it can be like tapping the opposite sides of the shoulders of the hands on the opposite knees, alternate nostril breathing. And the purpose of this is there's something about this cross-body work that gets that tricks the two hemispheres of the brain into working together. Normally they try to keep their functions very separate and isolated, but it gets them working together. And I find that when I daven with my whole brain, as it were, that it's a richer experience and that I go deeper into the davening, and it just makes it feel more holy to me. Debarti.
Yeah, Shamati. There's a great book written a number of years ago that was then translated, I think, into English now. Uri Erlich's book on prayer. It's called Kol Atzmotai Tomarna, from the book of Psalms. All my bones shall declare your glory. And it's about the non-verbal elements of prayer and the physical gestures and the physical postures that go along with it, because we often think of prayer in either cerebral or certainly in linguistic terms. But what Uri is arguing here is that since the time of the Talmud, and really looking back into biblical prehistory, prayer has involved the totality of one's body. And bilateral stimulation is a great way of coming to that kind of awakening. It reminds me also of one of the stories that they actually tell about Rabbi Shapiro when he was giving a talk. I think I told you this about the Kesher Shel Satan, about the necktie. Didn't we talk about this? No? Oh my gosh, must have been in one of my other classes. So Rabbi Shapiro was giving a lecture. I was giving a Hasidic drush once in his yeshiva, I believe, and he taught in Da'at Moshe, which is was his yeshiva in Warsaw, and he was giving a class, and someone walked in with a necktie, and he stopped, and so people were wondering why, and one of the obvious reasons is that neckties at that time were seen as something very modern, and seen as something a little bit flamboyant and ostentatious in a way that didn't befit the pious humility of a servant of the divine. But that wasn't the reason why Rabbi Shapiro stopped, because he told the person, he said, take that thing off. And the person, begins to fumble with it, and he says, don't you know that the necktie, is the Kesher Shel Satan? It's the satanic knot. Why? Because it divides between the heart and the mind, between the mind and the body. And that you can't do. And the point is one of integration. So you're sitting and listening here with just a disembodied head. you're going to get nothing from it because the wisdom needs to saturate all the rest of what you are. So, yeah, thanks, Beth. That really resonates. It really resonates with me. Okay, good. Just one of the, well, I can leave it there, but I did want to say that there was a contemporary Hasidic thinker in 21st century Jerusalem. His name is Ichimeyer Morgenstern, which some of you may have heard of. Really interesting person. Doing something kind of new in the history of Hasidism in that he has started his own Hasidic court. He has some lineage, but he is not the direct descendant of someone like one generation or two generations removed. It goes back much farther, that he has connections to Hasidic leaders. And he grew up in England and went to yeshiva in Manchester. He's doing something new in that he's combining all the different streams of Hasidism together, but he's also combining that with all of the different Kabbalistic sources that are now available, which was not the case in Eastern Europe because of the ingathering of Sephardic and Ashkenazi Kabbalah and so many different kinds of mysticism. He really has it all at his fingertips, and rather than saying, oh, I do this and I don't do that, he's trying to bring it together into something new. It's quite remarkable. A few years ago, they published a book of his teachings. He didn't write it, but he wrote the what's called in Hebrew the haskama, or the approbation. So he considers it at least valid. They wrote a book of all of his kind of like practical instructions of how you do this. So when the Baal Shem Tov talks about finding the light of divinity in the letters of Torah, Rabbi Morgenstern gives you instructions how to do this. First you think about that, and then you breathe twice, and then you think about this, and then you do that. Or if you want to have this moment of illumination in prayer, this is how you do it. And it's a quite remarkable book because there are so few of these in the Hasidic bookshelf. There's nothing quite like this one. It's called B'yam Darkecha Hadracha La'avoda Lama'aseh. So like practical guide for developing sacred work, something like that. I think it's not in English yet, but it is. It has appeared in Hebrew, and the Hebrew is super simple. It's meant to be something that is widely accessible. There are passages there which, you have to take them with a grain of salt, given that where they come from. This is not someone who has been through the revolutions of feminism. This is not someone who's read broadly in the humanistic traditions. So if there are certain things that you can bracket, I find it to be a book that is incredibly nurturing, and quite unique for that. Okay, great. So let's continue, unless anyone has any other questions, and let's talk about the world itself as a source of revelation. Okay, so we've done Shanah, we've done Nefesh. Let's think about Olam. Olam, the world that we live within in all of its physicality and all of its beauty, is seen in Jewish mystical sources and Hasidism in particular as a site of revelation. And this is tied both to the unfolding vision of Hitgalut or Matan Torah as something that takes place across the generations, but it is intensified in Hasidism because in Hasidut there is a firm commitment to a principle, Melo chol haaretz kvodo, nothing other than divinity exists, everything is God. So this vision of divine immanence, with an A, of divine immanence of God's presence in the physical world, gets combined with those ancient traditions of revelation to say or to show that the world is not only filled, saturated, shimmering with a kind of divinity. It's not just something you see, it's also something you can hear. It's also something to which you can become attuned. And it's also something to which, after that attunement, from which you can learn. So we learn from the world around us. We're going to talk about the implications of that in just a few moments. But let's begin with a passage from Rabbi Menachem Nahum of Chernobyl. So Evie has put those into the chat, and I will put the Just 1 second. Can't do two things at once. Can't walk and chew gum. I will put the Google Doc into the chat for anyone who wants to see it there. So I'm here on the top source, the first source, Rabbi Menachem Nachum of Chernobyl. Just by way of saying, the word Olam in Hasidic sources is, this is not the best literal etymology. I wouldn't defend this on linguistic grounds, but on conceptual grounds, I think it works. The word Olam, or world, is often understood as related to the word Ne'elam, or hidden. So the way that that's understood in Hasidic sources is that the world conceals divine presence. The world conceals divine revelation. But the first Hasidic teaching in the first Hasidic book, 1781, Rabbi Yaakov Yosef of Polnoya, is that as soon as you realize that God is hidden in a place, God's not really hidden. You can open your eyes. You may not be able to see it immediately, but if you attune yourself, that presence is there. It's only when God is doubly hidden, when you forget that God is hidden in a particular place, that's when you're really in trouble. And that, says Rabbi Yaakov Yosef of Polnoya, is when you have been shut into a prison of your own making. You see the world as an ordinary place, and that imprisons, kind of incarcerates your mind. And he says the opposite is also true. We read this in the Baal Shem Tov class last year, for those of you who were with me there. Rabbi Yaakov Yosef of Polnoya quotes the Gemara from Rosh Hashanah, the Gemara about Rosh Hashanah. Is it in Rosh Hashanah? I don't remember. Might also be. No, it's in Sota. That Yosef goes out of prison on Rosh Hashanah. Yosef goes out of prison on Rosh Hashanah. He gets out of Pharaoh's prison on Rosh Hashanah. And this, says Rabbi Yaakov Yosef of Polnoya, Yosef, he's writing about himself, is what happens when you meet the Baal Shem Tov. You go out of prison, your mind opens, the walls come down, and you see the world as flush with and saturated with divinity. So what we're seeing, Tomer, I'll get to that in just 1 second. It probably is. So what we're seeing in this source from Rabbi Menachem Nachum of Chernobyl is a continuation of that way of thinking, further connected with revelation itself. So he says as follows. He quotes B'divar Hashem Shamayim Na'asu. I've skipped one word in the Hebrew there, and I apologize for that. I'll put it into the Google Doc in just a minute. God's word creates the heavens. Book of Psalms, classical linguistic theology. How does creation happen? Creation happens through the divine word. Is that divine word gone? No, it's there forever, as it says in the book of Psalms, Leolam Hashem davarcha nitzav b'shamayim. Forever, O Lord, your word stands in the firmament, not just in the form of the heavens, but in a kind of divine word that reverberates within the physical world. So, says Rabbi Menachem Nachum of Chernobyl. Keep going just a little bit down. Yeah, it's in like the fourth line. He quotes that B'sha'a she'amar hakadosh baruch hu anochi Adonai Elohecha hayu shom'in mikol mekomot kol sho'eg anochi Adonai Elohecha afilu even mekir v'lo haya makom panui shelo haya nishma misham anochi. There are many different retellings of Revelation, and this is one of them. It comes to us from the latest of all Midrashic collections, Shemot Rabbah, which is so late it's actually medieval. When God said, "I am the Lord your God," it was heard from each and every place. What was heard? This roaring voice, this calling voice. Shoeg is like what a lion does. This roaring voice saying, "I am the Lord your God." Even the stones in the wall, that's a rabbinic way of saying even the most mundane or seeming inanimate objects, are calling out, I am the Lord your God. And no place was empty of this, and there was no place in which this voice was not heard, no place from which this voice was not heard. You might say this is the exact opposite of Maimonides' understanding of Revelation. In a certain sense, if Maimonides understands Revelation as being primarily an event experienced by Moses, the perfectly trained prophet, both in Mishneh Torah and also in parts of in Moreh Nevuchim, he describes everyone else as hearing a kind of buzzing noise. Only Moses can really make sense of it, but the others hear something that feels more like what we used to hear on cell phones in the early days, where not only were just words being dropped, but it was it was kind of like, did anyone remember 56K modems? You would pick one of the, I said that to my class the other day at Stanford, and they were like, wait, there was a time when not everyone had broadband? I was like, well, you guys have no idea. So it was like that noise when you would pick it up and you'd kick someone off the phone, off the internet, and they'd have to spend another 4 hours writing an email. Everyone else heard that, and only Moses got the real revelation, and that's why he was the one who is the lawgiver. It's also different than the assumption that some rabbinic sources make of everyone hearing just one, and then the second, and then Moses hearing the other 8, although you could square these two traditions. It's also a little bit different than that tradition which is found in the Babylonian Talmud of when people hear the first commandment, their minds are overwhelmed and they die, and God resurrects them. Then they hear the second, and then they die, and God resurrects them again, and then God says, okay, enough, we're going to move on from this. I see how this is going. Here, there's no implication that this is overwhelming. In fact, what you have is, I don't know, is it a cacophony or a symphony? It's a world in which everything vibrates with that kind of divinity. So what do we make of this? How does this change your understanding of Revelation? And let's think about it in the past tense before we get into the present tense.
It makes me think of some things I've been reading recently about some kind of sparks of consciousness inhabiting plant life and even what we normally think of as an inanimate life, like rocks. And it leads to the idea that, well, in fact, you mentioned this on our first session of this group of classes, that there were animals at Mount Sinai too.
Mhm.
And the mountain was there,
Yeah,
and the grasses was there, and the soil was there.
yeah,
And so it kind of suggests to me that revelation was being heard just echoing everywhere.
yeah, yeah. So it's not just heard everywhere, echoing everywhere, shouting everywhere. It's like kind of reverberation of this. So it's not only are the glasses, so not only are the animals there, not only are the grasses there, Mount Sinai is not just the mountain that people are standing on, but itself is a part of Revelation. It's not only that they're receiving, but it's there that there they are broadcasting. Here, everything is shouting forth divinity. And it's interesting that the first commandment is the one that is here highlighted, or the so-called first commandment, although it's kind of hard to understand it as a commandment. It's a declaration, it's an introduction, it's a commandment to believe in God, maybe, depending on how you understand it. But I mean, you might understand it as a declaration of presence. Anochi Adonai Elohecha. I here understood perhaps better as, I, the Lord your God, am all that is. I am a part of everything. So here, Revelation is reimagined not as a moment in which God writes a book and hands it to a people, but as a moment in which the world is kind of electrified with divine consciousness and electrified with this kind of divine presence. So receiving this revelation is not just about, oh, I need to do this and I need to do that, or even to know that God now dwells in a book. But this kind of understanding of revelation means that you see, I hope, the world as a site of revelation and the world as an agent of revelation. Yeah, Gurval, you had a question or a comment?
I think it was what you just said, which is that it's that the divine is in everything. It's not that we can hear it from everywhere. It is that it is in everything. And it's interesting because there was some obviously strong reactions against that view, which was perceived to be borderline pantheistic and you know I went back to the pagan view of the trees are divine and I think it was, I don't know if it was kind of which rabbi, kind of Hasidic rabbi, really tried to say Kadosh 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 Hashem Tzavot Melech Haaretz Kevodo. Do you hear what that means? Because that is what it means. It means that it's God is in everything, and so he was just wrestling with the opponents of this vision, because he really felt that it was true to Torah, and a cardinal teaching of Hasidus is that.
And pantheism is scary for people. Pantheism is scary because it breaks down boundaries. It's question about how are some things permitted and how are some things forbidden. There are questions around who and what then has access, and then questions of authority that become very frightening. In Eastern Europe, there is a disagreement between the Hasidim and the Mitnagdim, as you just alluded to, for sure. In Western Europe, Mendelssohn and the others are embroiled in something which in German is called the Pantheismusstreit, the pantheism controversy, coming on the heels of ways that people have read Spinoza, and people are yelling at each other, and the worst thing you could call someone is a pantheist or a Spinozist, except the ones who take that and run with it. It was seen as something that you could sort of like, it was the Red Scare of the 18th century. You could get people blacklisted by proving that they were really pantheists. And what you find in Hasidism is really a kind of full bore acceptance of the fact that, yeah, not only is that okay, but it's actually a cornerstone of our theology. And they work out all the other questions. Like, why are some things permitted and why are some things not, right? This is actually really interesting. In the Hasidic imagination, that's what the snake says. The snake says what the Mitnagdim say. If the snake says, well, if all things are God, then isn't this apple, this fig, this banana, whatever it is, isn't this also God? Shouldn't you taste it? And Rabbi Levi Yitzchak Berdichev, who explicitly grapples with that, says, yeah, but like not all parts of God are meant to be consumed. That's why we have the Torah. It gives us rituals for thinking about the ways in which we to say that all things are divine is not to say that all things are permitted. In the same way that many secular philosophers have demonstrated that to say that God is no longer a divining force that ordains particular actions does not mean that all things are permitted. Here, as we continue, Rabbi Menachem Nachum takes us back to the beginning of thinking about the fact that heavens were created by the divine word. We talked about creation, revelation as being intertwined in this understanding of revelation, that revelation actually begins with creation. He's going to continue in that vein now. He's going to quote, Memale hakol ki melo haaretz kvodo. Everything is filled with divinity. Everything is radiating divine presence. Vihu shochen b'chol davar, and God dwells within all things. Shochen, immanently dwells. That's the sacred divine feminine. Shekhinah, that's the sacred divine presence. Each and every thing Therefore, nimtza, thus, lo haya makom panui shelo yomar anochi. Therefore, there was no place that didn't say, I am. I am. So here he ties it to the present. V'yuval al derech ze k'sha'adam mekadesh atzmo u'medaber b'kedushat haTorah k'ra'ui. Az afilu min ha'aretz asher nitkadesh svivav ba'ashpat kedusha yishma kol kedushat haTorah u'kafi erech godo yecholto lekadesh hamakom yishkon bo hashchina. So here I didn't translate this, and I'll put this in. I didn't realize how important it was until I was reviewing it this morning. He ties it into the present by saying as follows. We can understand this according to what we see with our own eyes, that when a person sanctifies themselves, mekadesh atzmo, that could mean a kind of pious abstemiousness. But what it so often means in Hasidism is not withdrawing from the physical world, but by deeply engaging with the physical world in a meaningful and sacred way. When you do that, you have created a kind of sacred connection to the physicality. And when you do that, umedaber b'kedushat haTorah, and you speak words of Torah, or you speak with a sense of holiness, as in the Torah. One of the interesting things that you find in Hasidism is that we talked about the fact that all mitzvot become vehicles for the divine, and in doing so, there's a kind of flattening. There's a Hasidic understanding of Lashon HaKodesh, of the holy tongue, which is not Hebrew, but about any language that you speak with a sense of sanctity. And they say you can speak Hebrew, and it can be a quite profane tongue. And you can speak Yiddish, Ukrainian, English, Spanish, whatever it is, with a sense of holiness, and it becomes sacred. And so here, umedaber b'kedushat haTorah can mean speaking words of Torah. It can mean infusing the things that you do with the spirit and the holiness of Torah. It can mean so many things. But I would understand this sentence of when you connect yourself in a strong and fertile way to the world around you, and when you speak with this kind of sanctity, karui, as is correct and as is fitting, then what happens? Even the place that you stand upon is filled with Torah. It's transformed. And I think you might ask the question, are you actually transforming the place? Or are you just opening yourself to the fact that it's already sacred, right? Like what Moses gets told by God, the place upon which you stand is Admat Kodesh. If you come to that, Yishma Kol Kedushat haTorah, you will hear. You will hear the voice of Torah spilling out of every place that you go. This is the story that you find all the time of the wanderings of the Hebraya in the Zohar. They come to a tree and they say this tree exudes words of Torah. It shimmers with words of Torah. The word that's often used there is tzechot, tzechota. It means brilliance, it means shimmering, it means eloquence, and it means beauty. And when you attune yourself in this way, and when you reconstruct yourself in this way, you walk through the world as a site of revelation. Every place that you go is one of those places that cried out, Anochi Adonai Elohecha. And so every place becomes like a tiny Mishkan. Every place becomes a tiny Har Sinai, or a big Har Sinai. In some places it's easier to find that. In some places it's harder to find that. At some times in our lives it's easier to find that, and at sometimes it's harder to find that. So here you have a text that clearly says creation and revelation are intertwined. Revelation happened in such a way that it is not just expansive in the sense of the divine voice encompassing wisdom that unfolds across the generations, and not just through text and not just through self, but the physical, what Beth, I think, correctly highlighted, we call inanimate, is actually deeply animate. It's animated by the same divinity that animates our own bodies and souls. That is the world in which we walk. So far, so good? Okay. I could ask what kind of economic policy might come from this, what kind of environmental policy might come from this. I think it's actually a really interesting and fertile way of thinking about our vision of the world, not as something that we simply extract from, but it's something that we exist in relationship with a sense of divinity. And I'm going to push that thinking a little bit farther as we go on to the next source. It's a famous one, often taught around this time in certain circles, from Eruvin 100b, Kuf Hamid Bet, about Revelation. If it hadn't have happened, it could have happened in different ways. So this is one of a number of different sources that talk about, had Revelation not happened, we could have done this. There are lots of people who have thought through this question in the Jewish canon. Rabbi Saadia said we would have gotten there eventually, but it just would have taken us, Saadia Gaon, it just would have taken us so long to understand the principles of Torah that God gave us a shortcut and really helped us out. For others, we would really have been lost without the Torah, and therefore it is what attunes us. It's like the tuning fork that allows us to see the divinity in the world. This is a very different species of that text. Amar Rabbi Yochanan ilmalei lo nitna Torah, hainu lemedin tzniut mechatul, gezel minemela, arayot meyona, derach eretz mitarnagol. If the Torah had not been given, we would have learned various attributes from the animals around us. Modesty from the cat, not to steal from the ant, certain kinds of sexual relationships from different animals. Okay, if I asked you to summarize this text in your own words, how would you describe it? What's the argument? What's it trying to tell us?
The entire Torah is embodied in the world, and the Anochi is ongoing at all times. You just have to listen and find it, or resonate with it.
Yeah, great. And where in specific is it found here?
In all aspects of God's creation.
True, but I mean, what are the aspects that are highlighted here?
It's the midot of each of God's creation.
Yeah, I mean, it's the animals, right? It's the animals as embodiments of these different midot. So we had earlier the avnei hakir, the even like the stones in the wall. There's got to be some English expression like the pebbles on the bottom of your foot or something like that, which is the things that are just seemingly so innocuous or seemingly so irrelevant to Revelation, even those two resonate with this kind of divinity. Here, I think the specific example of the animals is a particularly interesting one because they are ones whose behaviors we can watch. We can learn something from them. Okay, great. Does this mean that the animal kingdom accords itself with the principles of Torah? Probably not. There are a lot of things I wouldn't want to learn from the animal kingdom. Tennyson is not the first one to have noticed, although he put it so beautifully, that nature is red in tooth and claw, and there are plenty of things that I would not want to see in the animal kingdom incorporated into human society. On the other hand, I think this text and this teaching from Rabbi Yochanan offers a really interesting prompt for thinking about the following question. Not about natural law, not about specific sort of traits that are given here, but what would happen if we put this text in dialogue with all of the others that we've been thinking about ongoing revelation and creativity, and we thought about it not as not as the animals confirming the Torah that we already knew, but what if we read it as a prompt for thinking about what is the Torah that the animals come to teach us that we wouldn't have otherwise known? In other words, is there a Torah of the cats? Is there a Torah of the ants? Is there a Torah of the dove, of the rooster, of the bears, of the birds, of whatever it might be? I began to think about it in this way after I read a book a number of years ago called Ways of Being by James Bridle. It's a book I like very much. James Bridle's argument, he's a very good science writer. James Bridle's argument is in this book is, as long as we have debates over artificial intelligence about will they be in the service of human need or not in the service of human need, will they be like us, will they not be like us, and we define the intelligence of artificial intelligence only in human terms, we have created two enormous roadblocks. One is that we see the possibility of artificial intelligence only in terms of its capacity to replicate what we already do. The second is that we claim intelligence only for ourselves and not for the world around us. Now, he's not the first one to point this out. The philosophers who rejected Aristotle understood that when Aristotle robbed animals of language, he also robbed them of rational thought, and therefore any kind of what we would think of as autonomy. So it's a long, long story, and the pre-Socratics and also some of the post-Socratic philosophers really pushed back against the notion that animals didn't have a kind of agency. If you combine that with the behavioralist approach of people like Skinner and with the way in which animals in the post-Cartesian world are described as nothing more than machines, then you get what we have now. But in the ancient world, in the medieval world, in the early modern world, animals were actually a keystone species in Jewish theology. They're agents of revelation, and that's where we're going to go now. And so what would happen if we opened up ourselves to thinking about what could we learn from the animals around us? What kind of multi-species, what in biological terms, in evolutionary biology is called heterospecific learning, the way that animals learn from one another, could humans actually be a part of? What a cramped definition of Torah to say Torah is the only thing, is only the thing that we got at Sinai, and therefore the animals have to recreate it. I think everything we've been doing up until this course, up until this point, is if Torah is so much more than that, then there are unique faces of all of you that you bring to the Torah, that you bring forth from the Torah. And the animals are exactly that. If you look at the passage from Eov, from Job, ask the beasts and they will teach you. She'al na behamot v'toreka. Ve'of hashamayim ve'agadlach. These are passages that are cited quite often in rabbinic sources and in post-rabbinic sources from actually learning from the world around us. One very good, if somber, example of this, which is not on the source sheet, but I'd be happy to share it with you, is that when Adam and Eve see the death of their child, of Abel, they don't know what to do because they've never buried someone. And they see these two crows fly by and bury one of their fallen comrades. There was just a really interesting recent dissertation about corvid burials. Like, evidently this is a thing. It's not just a legend. The Adam and Eve watch this and they know what to do and they bury their child. And for this, the ravens are blessed. A version of this is found already in the Midrash. Then there's a version that you find in the Quran. And then there's a version that you find in a post-Islamic Jewish source that reverberates, resonates back with the version in the Quran. But they're all rooted in the same principle. I love that text much as it's heartbreaking because we often think of reflection on mortality or awareness and consciousness of mortality as one of those uniquely human characteristics. And we don't have any idea about the inner life of those ravens, but according to this myth, we learn how to deal with the loss of our loved ones from the animals around us. And that's just one example from within the Jewish tradition of what we would call heterospecific learning, what we can learn from the animals around us. If you go to the sources on page 2 of Tzfat, of Rabbi Chaim Vital, of Isaac Luria, there the ancient legends of reading the birds we talked about last time, or watching the clouds resurge, and no one's scared of them. People do it all the time. And here, like what you find from Chaim Vital, you get a clear declaration as to why that is so. Everything in the world, the worms, the flies, the creepy crawlies, declare God's wisdom, declare Torah, declare something for us to learn. And again, I don't know, I would certainly caution us against learning one-to-one correspondences to how we orchestrate human society, although there are really interesting ways of animal governance, right? Like when guinea pigs, anyone have guinea pigs? They're the cutest animals in the world. They have ways of decision making in their little herds, which seem to work kind of better than democracy at the current moment about how do you get up and move from one place to another. Elk have this too. There are ways in which there are other ways of patterning our society which are really interesting. But I think what James Bridle is pointing out in this book is that there are so many different kinds of intelligences. Humans have some, but we're not the only ones. And animals have cultural traditions. This is fairly well established now. How do we know this, at least in certain animals? Whales have songs that they pass from one community to another. Whales even have fads, right? Like the salmon on top of the orca. There was an orca in the 80s that they took a picture of, and it had a salmon on top of its head. And then it was just like swimming around like that. And then all the other orcas in that pod did it for a couple of weeks, and then it was gone. It was done. It had sort of like burned its way out. And the ways that these traditions are passed on within groups, within families, within what we would call cultural structures, mean that there are different kinds of wisdom for how you live in the world, that particularly in our time of changing circumstances, in our time in which much of what we thought we knew about the world, be it geopolitical, be it physical, is transforming in many and profound ways. Here we follow Anna Tsing's injunction, Anna Tsing, the anthropologist, to think like mushrooms. How do you grow in difficult circumstances? Here I'd say, well, maybe we should also think with the animals, because the animals have tremendous Torah for how to live in complicated and changing times. I'm going to skip over the next two sources that come to us about how do you learn to read the world and how do you learn to read from fish. And we'll come back to Rabbi Nachman's passage about singing with the animals in just a moment, but I'd actually like you to skip to the very end. Because here we see creation and revelation coming back together in a way that I think is quite repercussive. You have on page 3, it's at the very middle, going down to the very bottom, a passage from Rabbi Yaakov Lehner of Ishbitz, a Hasidic rabbi from the mid-19th century who lived in Poland right about the time that Poland was beginning to industrialize. And he writes in a sermon a very interesting reframing of creation, which I often think about these days. And he reads the verse, Naaseh Adam b'tzelmeinu u'kdemutenu, let us make human beings in our image, not as God speaking in the royal we would like to do this, and not as God speaking to the angels, as is sometimes assumed, and not as speaking to some kind of heavenly cluster of midot or qualities, but God is speaking to whom? Just read the creation story. What's been happening up until day 6? It's not a trick question, I don't think. Human beings come last because the mosquitoes are created before us and all the other stuff. So this text is reading Genesis 1:26, Nase Adam, as God talking to everything else that was there in creation. God says to the creatures and the rocks and everything else, let's create human beings in our image. Now hold on to that for just a minute. So he says this to all of the other creatures. And when they are formed, God asks each and every one of them, do you want to be created? This is before we hit the stage. And evidently they say, yeah. Yeah, cool. I guess we do. So this is what the Gemara says. Ledatan nivra'u, letzivionam nivra'u. They were created according to their consent, with their wisdom. So God asks the salmon, do you wish to be created? And they say, yes. God asks the grizzly bears, do you wish to be created? And the answer is yes. God asks the beetles, do you wish to be created? And the answer is yes. Okay. But each creation is asked individually, and none of the others are asked about each other. Why? Says Rabbi Lehner, because the more, what we would call, the thicker the biodiversity, the more number of species there are, the healthier the world will be, and each one will benefit one another. And he says, animals, by and large, lack the capacity to exterminate one another. That happens to not be true. We know that on biological grounds, animals, whether they are megafauna or minor fauna, or they are even things that we kind of don't consider animals because they're not, like bacteria, we know that animals exterminate one another. But I think his point, which is going to come home to roost in just a moment, is that they do so at a scale and in a way that is not matched with those of humans. So he then says, but when it comes time to ask human beings about whether or not they wish to be created, every animal is consulted. Every animal is asked, do you want the humans around? And they say yes, evidently. We're here. That's the fact. And so, according to this source, the question is, why must they all be asked? Because, argues Rabbi Lehner, human beings have a capacity to destroy that outstrips their ethics from time to time. And so, we are reminded that the animals gave their consent to our being here. And then the last line, I want you to focus on this. Kulam natnu mikocham lehatzarat adam. All of them gave permission to the creation of humanity. Another way of translating that line, which is really opaque, koach means potential. It means power. It means that which lies within. Koach and poal, the inner versus the outer, the potential versus that which can be executed. Another way of translating it, and I think an equally good way, is that kulam natnu mikocham lehatzarat adam means each and every one of them gave something to the human being. Now, there's an activity that I've done in other contexts called the Council of All Being, which is something that I learned from Joanna Macy, where I do this in my religion and ecology classes, where you have a couple of people as people sit in the middle, and everyone else dresses up as animals, and they talk about what their lives are like in the current moment, and they do like real talk to the humans. And then as time goes on, they each give the human being a blessing and say, I bless you as the bear, that you have resilience and an omnivorous capacity to learn from the world around you. I bless you as the beetle to be rigid and flexible, whatever it might be. And it can be an enormously effective ritual in decentering our human way of thinking. And the reason that I bring this in the context of thinking about revelation is that if we think about revelation as a moment of awakening, not just of like the gift to the Jews that then radiates outward for Rosenzweig, we have something, and that we at the center of the star radiate this out to other human beings. What you have in these sources is a way of seeing Mount Sinai as a particular moment that is not just indicative and not just emblematic, but it's a specific moment in a process in which all kinds of life and even the things that we describe as non-living or inanimate reverberate with, shimmer with, vibrate with this kind of divine call. But that call also makes claims upon us. That call makes claims upon us. And if you see the animals as sites of revelation, past revelation, future revelation, and also our being in this world is one of obligation to their consent, of gratitude to their affirmation. It provides a totally different orientation for thinking about animals not just as companion species, but as our teachers and as agents of revelation. So I want to pause here. We've got 4 more minutes. Let's reflect. Let's think together. Questions, comments?
Feel free to make comments or send any questions in the chat as well, or you can unmute yourself to speak out loud.
And Tomer, just to the point about the book, that's one part of it. I think that they're probably going to spin this out in many different versions, in many different volumes. It's kind of like in Chabad, they'll have one book of the Rebbe's teachings, and then it will be like 18 volumes in English. I think that's one of them, because I can only see one page of it, but it's the Yichudim of Elul. So I think what it's going to be is practical wisdom, practical spiritual instruction for the month of Elul. Then they'll probably do one for other months of the year, and they'll probably do one on prayer. And things like that. So it looks like the same thing, but
Many thanks. Many thanks,
yeah,
Rabbi.
yeah, of course.
One thing that I was thinking about, I've personally had a number of companion animals, currently dogs, but also cats and horses. And they're habituated to be extremely interactive with us. And in the case of the dogs and the horses, they can learn to be working animals and have some apparent enjoyment of being working animals. This isn't like, the donkey pulling the 5,000-pound cart up a hill kind of enjoyment. That's not enjoyment.
Right.
But they seem to take some pleasure in it. Just before class started, I hauled my recycling can and my garbage can out to the curb for pickup. And I always take my naughty female dog with me so she doesn't get in trouble and chewing things up in the house. She knows exactly how long it takes me to go out and come back again, and knows she can chew what she can chew up while I'm gone. So I have her go out and help me with it. And she looks so purposeful. It's like we're taking the trash out. And it's amazing to me that we don't have more relationships like that with more species. Maybe farmers do, and I just don't know about it.
I think one of the beautiful things about this vision of animals is that there are certain kinds of, let's say, revealers that come to us as domesticated animals or our companion species. I like that much more than domesticated animals. Um, but it used to be that we had so much more contact with animals. There were so many more of them, and we had so much more contact of them. And I know we have to close, Evie. If you want to know a way to think
We're
about
good for today.
Oh, okay, good. So I can go on for just a second. If you want to find another way of thinking about animal revelation that is um, almost the almost the photographic negative of that, look for the video of Kimmy Werner swimming with a shark. Kimmy Werner, who's a famous spearfisher woman, a champion from Hawaii, was filming a documentary when she encountered an 15 or 18-foot great white shark. And they were filming this. And so because she has the training that she has, rather than freaking out and swimming away, she slowed down, which is what you do if you're a free diver. She slowed down and swam toward the shark. And because of that, she established herself as a dominant force on the landscape. And she ended up just like hanging out with the shark for a while. It's a remarkable, I would say, it's a remarkable encounter. It's also a remarkable metaphor for thinking about spiritual work. And it's also a remarkable moment of thinking about the way that an encounter with an animal that lasts 3 minutes can be utterly transformative and can be revelatory. Another is that essay that I sent earlier, which I can put back in the chat for anyone who missed it, from Barry Lopez, about the way that time transforms when you encounter an animal that is a so-called wild animal. And it's another kind of connection and another kind of, I guess, a electrifying reminder that we exist within this thick biodiversity of this world. And the more we lose, the fewer opportunities that we have the fewer opportunities that we have to hear God's voice.
Any more questions, or should we end for today?
Let's end. I'm happy to always be in touch with people. Please
Okay,
don't
perfect.
hesitate to reach out to me. It's wonderful to see you all and to have the opportunity to learn with you and to learn from you. I guess I'll bless us that as we go into the holiday of Revelation, we remember a number of things. One is that these moments of revelation that happen across the holiday of Shavuot are meant to be emblematic rather than exhaustive, and they remind us that what happens after Shavuot can be equally revelatory, and that we remember that revelation is not just something that happens in the mind, but it's something that happens deep within the inner wells of the self, within the texts of our tradition, which are ever expanding and ever connected, and within the thickness of the animate and so-called inanimate world that we live in. There is nothing in our lives, nothing in ourself, and nothing in our world does not say, "Here I am, speaking with the divine voice."
Thank you so much, Rabbi Mays, and thank you everyone who joined us as well for this session. Look out for our next classes that will be scheduled hopefully soon. And Chag Sameach and Lihitraot, everyone.
Take good care.
Lihitraot. Bye-bye.
Thank you.